friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. I'm going to be giving you some historical fiction recommendations today. I'm going to be matching up my book recommendations with the Historathon book prompts. If you don't know, I'm hosting a historical fiction readathon currently in the month of November. I know it's already like the middle of the month, so you don't have to read these in November, but these are just historical fiction recommendations. You can read whatever you want, but they do match the prompts and some of the challenges. And I read a lot of historical fiction. It is easily my top genre, always, every single year, and I have so many books that I can recommend for a lot of these. So I just kind of picked what I was currently in the mood for recommending. I know some stuff on here that I've probably recommended before that I feel strongly about, and some authors that I talk about often, and some maybe I haven't, so I wanted to try to mix it up. So for historical fiction books that have been adapted to film or TV, I actually created a whole Goodreads list, and a few of you gave some really good recommendations to add to that list. I'll say it again, if you come up with any that I've missed, please let me know down below so I can add it to the list. There wasn't really a list that I could find online that had all the historical fiction books that have been turned into movies, and I know that there's a lot of classics that are probably missing from the list, but I just haven't done the research to figure out what classics are considered historical when they were written that were then adapted to a movie or a mini-series or something. So for this prompt, I wanted to recommend a book that I obviously read the book, but then have also watched the film or adaptation and have liked it just as much, or I can comment on that. And a lot on the list, I have either not watched the adaptation yet or have watched it and didn't like it. Anyways, all that to say, I have two books here that I feel like I both enjoyed the books and the watching experience. So I'm going to talk about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne. This is a upper teen book. I wouldn't really consider it middle grade, but I guess it could be. And it follows a young boy whose father is the leader of a concentration camp. He's a Nazi officer, and he befriends a Jewish boy on the other side of the fence. And it was so sweet and absolutely heartbreaking. Just a devastating read and also a watch. The movie was incredible. I did watch the movie first and I read this book just a few years back, but both are superb. And then another recommendation that I actually did watch the movie first and then read the book also not that long ago, but that is Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. A nostalgic pick for those of us that had to read this in school, but the movie was also great from what I can remember because gosh, I forgot the actress's name, but the person that plays Rory Gilmore in Gilmore Girls is the young actress in the film. But this is about a small town, so it definitely has a good sense of place. And there's a particular family, the Tuck family, that doesn't age. And this one young girl gets swept up in with this family, trying to figure out why they're not aging. And kind of a bit of a romance. The romance is a little bit sketchy in terms of the age and stuff, but I did really love this book and really love the movie. Next, I will recommend you some historical romance. I think the biggest one on the list that I have read, and I love this book so much. I've read it 3 times. I know it's not for everyone, but I'm talking about Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. I read this book probably like 12 or so years ago for the first time. I remember absolutely loving the book and then being so excited to find out that there is a show adaptation as well. I actually love some aspects of the show more in terms of what they did with some of the characters, but this is just a story that is so steeped in history, and then Claire and Jamie are just such a wonderful couple to root for and great characters, even though they're flawed. And there's also so much drama and so much at stake and just a lot going on. And there's a ton of heavy stuff and content that people don't like to read about as well. So I get it. There's very graphic, detailed sexual assault scenes all over the series, but in this book, very intense. There's also, I mean, guess you could play like the main whole romance starts off as kind of an adulterous, bigamous situation because Claire is already married to someone from a different time period and then has to go to a different time period and marry someone else and falls in love with that person, which usually, again, I don't read about that kind of stuff. I don't love that topic, but for some reason I love this book and I'll stand by it. This is definitely one of those books that's like an exception to the rule for me. I just love it. And I definitely don't love the rest of the series. Like, they're all okay. They're a bit long, they're a bit drawn out, they're a bit too much. But the characters, like the main reason to keep going is because of Claire and Jamie and their relationship and their family and now how things have changed over the years. The first book, honestly, just on its own is great. But yeah, there's a lot in here and it's set in Scotland, so it has a wonderful sense of place and definitely an era that I'm not familiar with. And there's a lot of villainous characters and terrible things that happen, but again, just so good. The heart of the story is the romance between these two, and it's wonderful. So I will forever love this book, and it will definitely always be like one of my top books of all time. Then last year I picked up A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin, and absolutely loved my time with this one. There is like a trend of these like Regency, I don't even know if it's the right time period, Regency, Victorian, or Edwardian, like I don't really know the difference between all those, but romances that are set in those periods that are kind of, you know, like the Bridgerton-esque vibes. There's balls and the London society and usually an outcast trying to fit in and trying to find romance, whether the theme is enemies to lovers or fake dating or all of this stuff. This one I read, one of the first ones I read, and absolutely loved my time with this one. It's also very like clean and innocent. It doesn't really have too much going on, not too much innuendo, but it is an enemies to lovers. This was definitely just like a sweet, fun, happy read that I just had a great time with. I haven't seen too many people really enjoy it like I did, but that's okay. And I've since tried quite a few other books that give off this vibe and have those like cute little illustrated covers of a girl and a guy in their Regency garb or whatever. And they have just been like way too intense off the bat for me in terms of either instant lovey or just very intense sexual innuendos or just situations that I'm like not really all about. So I haven't had too much success finding other books that are like this that I enjoy, because a lot of those I just DNF'd because they were giving off the same kind of vibe and same kind of energy, if you know what I mean. Also, for historical romance, I have to recommend Last Christmas in Paris by Hazel Gaynor and Heather Webb. This was a book I read last year, and if you're sitting on this book, if it's on your TBR, read it in December. It's just the perfect read. And it also is the war and conflict prompt because it is an epistolary novel, and it is about two people that just fall in love over the course of many years through letter writing and meetings. And it was the most like romantic, wholesome read that I read in a while. Highly recommend. If you are a fan of Guernsey, read Last Christmas in Paris, and I think you'll like it even better. Next, I have some recommendations for historical mystery. The Unknown Beloved by Amy Harmon. She's one of my top favorite historical fiction authors. If you know me at all, I own several of her books right there. And this one I also really loved, and it's definitely a historical like mystery thriller at heart. The main characters are trying to find a murder that is running rampant in the town of Cleveland, Ohio in the 1920s, 1930s. And so that is definitely like the plot that propels the book. But there's also this really sweet age gap romance. There's an older man and a younger woman. I was really here for it. I was really here for their relationship, and it was very sweet. So this definitely has some romance elements, has the big mystery thriller element for sure. And there's also a tiny little bit of magical realism because she sees like people and senses people through their clothing and gets a sense of who they are, and it's very interesting to the plot of the book. I love this one, and I definitely think it's a bit underrated. I mean, Amy Harmon, I think in general, is an underrated historical fiction author. And next, for a historical mystery. Now, I'm picking books that are mainly historical fiction with a suspenseful element, not necessarily a historical fiction mystery series, because there are quite a few out there, but I just don't read too many of those. I'm currently in the middle of one, Maisie Dobbs. Would recommend that, but I talk about that in so many of my videos that I wanted to pick other stuff. But there really isn't too much out there that I could at least research in historical fiction that deals with a real situation that is also quite suspenseful. And so I absolutely fell in love with The Nature of Fragile Things by Susan Meisner, because this deals with the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And so there is a survival element and a tragedy element to the story, but also a big mystery element with the main character. And she's a mail order bride that marries a man and is taking care of his young daughter, and then everything is not as it seems. He is not who he seems to be, and there's just very interesting, mysterious, suspenseful things at play in this book, which I thought were absolutely wonderful. Also a great sense of place because it is set in 1906. You feel the earthquake and you just feel it all really well written in this book. Next, I'll recommend some historical fiction books that have famous historical figures as the main character, and I can't shut up about The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This features Martha Ballard, who was a midwife in the 1700s. I believe it's 1700, yeah. Maine, 1789. And this, very similar to Nature of Fragile Things, has a very strong like suspenseful thriller mystery aspect to the book because there is a murder and you're trying to figure out who did what. But the characters are so well done, and I absolutely loved Martha Ballard. She's an older character in this book. Her marriage is also so strong and wonderful and portrayed really well, and has a very strong sense of place in Maine, in this colonial town, colonial America. A 5-star amazing book. I know that it is currently in the Goodreads Choice Awards for historical fiction, and I voted for it. And I also hope that you read it if you're a historical fiction fan. It also has some good like representation for social issues because it highlights women in the town that have been sexually assaulted and just like the ramifications of everything going on there. It's just a perfect book. Another one for famous historical figures that I would recommend is A Well-Behaved Woman by Therese Ann Fowler. This book is all about Alva Vanderbilt, and one of the first books I read that like really highlighted a historical female figure, and it was just her story. But I was just really swept along in this book, and it was really easy to read. It's a chunky book, but I flew through it. She's also a very flawed character, not perfect by any means. There's definitely hints of infidelity and just like stuff awry in her relationships and the way she views and treats certain people, but it was written really well, and I feel like I learned a lot about her and all about Gilded Age New York and architecture of New York because she was involved there, and a bit of the Vanderbilt family. It was a good one. Next, I'll talk about war and conflict. I feel like there are tons and tons and tons and tons of historical fiction that have to do with war and conflict, but I do have a recommendation. I love this book so much, and it has to do with the London Blitz during the Second World War, and it is Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. I love this series. It is, I think, a 3-book series, and I think there's a few more maybe coming out. The series is Overall great, not as strong as the first book for me. I loved this one. It has the perfect blend of being very sad and heartbreaking and real of what happened, but also has a lightness to it and a hope, which I really appreciate and really need in my heavy books that deal with very heavy themes and topics and time periods, because there needs to be some hope and light at the end of the tunnel. Otherwise, it's way too bleak and depressing to read. This follows Emmy Blake, who wants to be a war correspondent. She wants to, be a published author and write, but she ends up writing for a women's advice column and has a horrible boss that doesn't want her to write certain things. Her romance relationships and her friendships, it's just so well done. A lovely book and a fun series, and highlights a unique aspect of the war that I think was really well done. Another underrated book that has to do with foreign conflict is Buried Beneath the Baobab Tree by, I'm going to butcher this name, my apologies, Adeobi Trisha Nwabani and Viviana Maza. This has to do with the 2014 horrible, atrocious massacre where 276 girls were kidnapped by the Boko Haram in Nigeria. So it has to do with that very specific conflict in Africa. And I know it's 2014, but I think that counts as historical because it's already set in the past and it is the moment that occurred. This book also works very well for the next prompt that I'm going to talk about, but historical fiction / nonfiction hybrid. This book has a nonfiction section at the end of the book. It's also part free verse, and so there is a historical fiction element to it, but it's very much seeped in the true events that happened and the perspective of the girls that were kidnapped and the atrocities that happened. It is a beautiful book, both outside and in. I think the cover is gorgeous and it is heartbreaking, and it highlights a very specific moment in history that is very sad but so important that a lot of people didn't know about. There is some nonfiction books that I do want to read. I think one is called like Beneath the Tamarind Tree that has to do with this conflict. So I do want to read some of those nonfiction, but this is a good blend of that historical fiction, nonfiction. It has a bit of both. Another book that blends the two genres, historical fiction and nonfiction, so well is Loving versus Virginia by Patricia Humphrey Powell. This book is all about the Supreme Court case where interracial marriage was legalized. This book is mainly told in free verse, but it reads like a true story, and it obviously has some actual facts of everything that happened. It's really well done, and again, highlighting this moment of history that maybe a lot of people don't know about, or this particular case that people are unfamiliar with, but it has a lot of timeline and the free verses and some artwork and quotes and photographs all mixed in. As with all of these, would highly recommend. Also, I guess this does have an adaptation, although I'm not sure if it was based on the book, but it's based on the story. There is a movie called Loving, which highlights this whole story, and it is also really well done. The next prompt is social issues / cultural perspectives. Also, this one works really well. I didn't think about that, but a big social issue, interracial marriage. A book that I read a while ago and really loved is Hum If You Don't Know the Words by Bianca Murray. This is set during the apartheid era in South Africa. This is a book that I have lost a lot of the details, so I feel like a reread is in order because I feel like I could read it again and it would be new to me. But I do remember it was very emotionally impacting and very informative. Like, I just learned about this time and space and history in South Africa that I wasn't as familiar with. I just knew the broad strokes, but this dived into some more specific history. And my other recommendation for this theme is not an underrated book, very well beloved, and I think quite hyped, is Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. A wonderful book, multi-generational story following two sisters that were separated. One stays in Ghana and one is sold in slavery, and it tells their separate stories and their generations down the line. It was very uniquely written and told kind of the history and the lives that have changed because of certain events. Like, it just was a really well done book, and I think it deserves all the praise that it gets. Next, for historical era exploration, that is a prompt that just means read something different than what you usually read, so it's going to be very subjective to who you are as a reader, and a lot of books that I've already mentioned might do that for you. But two I want to recommend. The first one is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. This is not only era exploration, this is also like genre exploration for me when I read it, because this has to do with alternate history and time travel. It was such a wild ride of a book, very fascinating to read. If you're a historical fiction fan, which you should be if you are watching this video, I just had a really good time with that one because it was just so different than what I usually read. So it follows a man that goes through time and he wants to go and alter the Kennedy assassination. He wants to go and change history for the better. And this explores a whole lot of things, but the main one being, can you change the past? And if so, how does that affect the future? So a little bit of that butterfly effect kind of thing. Really well done. Such an interesting read. Another one I'm going to recommend is The Nesting Dolls by Alina Adams. This follows a multi-generational family in 3 different timelines. It's set in the 1930s, and then in the 1970s, and then in the 2000s. And it's told from the female's perspective, and it skips a generation but tells the 3 different stories and how the past affects the future. I think I found this book very relatable as a first-generation Ukrainian Russian person, that my parents immigrated here, being born American but still very much seeped in the Slavic culture. And the past timelines are set in Odessa and also explores the Siberian gulags and imprisonment and the harsh conditions in Siberia. This is a great great read for those that love a multi-generational story, multiple timelines, and maybe exploring some Slavic Russian history as well. And finally, strong sense of place. A good historical fiction book has to have a strong sense of place, and a lot of the books I mentioned do that. I want to highlight two others that I think do a really good job. The first is The Snow Child by Ewan Ivey. This is a book that is perfect for the winter season, and it is set in the Alaskan wilderness, and it follows a family and has a bit of a magical realism component to it, but just a really strong sense of place of being in Alaska. I can't really tell you what the time frame was, but it was like the homestead time in Alaska, and it was very atmospheric. Another very hyped big book that does have a movie adaptation is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and I think this also has a really good strong sense of place, just very atmospheric in the bog and the swamp of South Carolina. It was also a historical mystery and does have a romance in it. This book kind of has it all. I haven't read it in a few years, but I did really like the book, and I did really like the movie. Those are just some of the historical fiction books that I've read that I really enjoyed, that I think would be worth your time. And if you're participating in a Historathon and still need one for a prompt and you're stumped, maybe one of these will work for that, or just add these to your TBR and read them a different time. Please let me know if you've read any of these books or have now added any of these to your list. Thank you so much for spending some time today with me, for watching, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Bye.